Right, let's get started. My name's Charlie Waterhouse. I'm a partner at the Brixton Project, and welcome tonight to the second of two incredible panels exploring legacies of colonialism in our public realm as part of Brixton's involvement in this year's London Festival of Architecture. And just talking of architecture, we find ourselves, of course, tonight in the wonderful department store built in 1906 as an expansion of the Bon Marché next door, the first department store in Britain, which was constructed, of course, at the height of the British Empire. And Brixton, let's not forget, back then was totally posh. No, yeah, absolutely. Of course, it's always been posh. But as the area's fortunes change, so too the buildings. And many of you here tonight, I'm sure, will think of this place as the home of the Refugee Council. And now it's been, I think the correct word is regenerated, and it's home to Squire and Partners. And I think I just wanted to kind of, who are a very prestigious architects firm, and it was just a kind of good reminder that we're never very far away from the ebb and flow of history in our built environment, which is what tonight is all about. And so nowhere is that more obvious than in our monuments and statues and public artworks. So for the best part of the last year, the Brixton Project has been working with Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation Art Collection, consulting with the local community about their statues of Robert Guy and Robert Guy. I should know this by now. Robert Clayton and Thomas Guy, whose considerable wealth derived largely from their involvement in the transatlantic trade in enslaved people, established the expansion of St Thomas's Hospital, the foundation of Guy's Hospital, and continues to fund an almost £1 billion charitable endowment that is put to use in Lambeth and Southwark. So tonight, hopefully, we're going to take that conversation into new territory, and we've got an absolutely unreal panel for tonight's discussion. And here's hoping I've got the right bits of blurb about you, because if I haven't, I'm in big trouble. So Natalie Cooper's PhD research is exploring the colonial legacies of the Horniman Museum, just up the South Circular, situating the museum's early institutional history within the context of the violent and extractive forces of empire. Natalie is taking a critical look at practices of collection, curation, display and interpretation. The museum's founder, Frederick J. Horniman, was a tea trader and a social philanthropist whose charitable reputation, surprise, surprise, appears increasingly unstable. And immediately to my right, Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman is an independent scholar activist employed as project director of the National Lottery Heritage-funded project Reclaiming Community Heritage, part of 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance, which many of us will be familiar with, also as public engagement coordinator for Citizens Researching Together at the University of Bristol, and as research fellow at the University of Warwick and the University of Exeter, where they are building a database of disputed or contested colonial statues in Britain and France for an initiative called Cast in Stone. To my immediate left, Raj Chadha is one of the country's leading criminal lawyers with expertise in serious and complex crime, financial crime, and public order. He acted in the Stansted 15 trial, described by the New Statesman as the most important political trial of our time. One of a handful of human rights specialists who can take on cases with political dimensions. He successfully acted for 2 of the Colston 4 and is also acting on behalf of my mate Claire, who's up on a charge for smashing some HSBC headquarters windows in protest at their continuing investment in fossil fuels as part of Extinction Rebellion. So thanks for that, Raj. And then last but not least, Robert Bevan is an award-winning journalist, author and heritage consultant, and has been architecture critic for the Evening Standard, amongst many other publications. He's also the author of the acclaimed The Destruction of Memory, and perhaps most pertinently for tonight, Monumental Lies, Culture Wars and the Truth About the Past. He is a member of ICOMOS, the heritage body that advises UNESCO, and the Blue Shield, which addresses heritage in crisis. So thank you ever so much, everybody, for coming and joining today. You'll all be glad. Everybody will be glad. I'm going to pipe down in a second. I'm hoping that we can have like a fairly free-flowing discussion this evening. But I just wanted to sort of start this off with one of the fundamental insights we've gleaned from our work with the community, and that is that it seems really obvious that the people are way ahead of institutions when talking about all this kind of stuff, with joining the dots of and then sort of beginning to unpick the entangled nature of colonial legacy. And Nathaniel, I just wanted to maybe turn to you first to get this started. What would your advice be to those institutions currently kind of caught in the decolonisation headlights? You know, how should Guy's and St Thomas's behave, for instance?
Thank you very much, and thank you for organising this conversation and organising it in Brixton. I would like to reply to you, not in my own words, but in the words of someone to whom I look up, and to whom I think these institutions should listen. This is James Baldwin in 1981. The young are the only hope. The example of their elders has placed them where they are, and those of the young who do not go under are the only hope we now have of the beginning of a new morality. There is certainly something chilling, for example, in the photograph of those black youths flogging the de-pedestaled statue of Cecil Rhodes. But he was, indeed, a murderous criminal. It should have been done by the elders long before. The children are right, and the elders were liars. And our children may also indeed become liars, but they will be forced to make their choices according to the options which we, their elders, do not dare, for the most part, to imagine. There is a new world coming, and it's just around the bend. A new world coming. This one's coming to an end.
So we could all go home now, can't we? That's absolutely amazing. I mean, Baldwin was obviously one of the most sort of eloquent of communicators, but I don't know whether anybody wants to come in, but what struck me was that was 1981, and the new world was coming in 1981. Presumably there'd been a new world coming in the sort of the end of the 60s as well, and there's still a new world coming in 2023. So I'm going to push you and say, what should an organisation like Guy's and St Thomas's be doing when they're too frightened to move?
You've said that it is the people who are ahead of the institutions. I think it is especially the young, and it is especially a certain sector of the young, be in no doubt that the folks who have pushed us to mobilize in the streets in the last decade, the perspective from which that mobilization has been organized has been black, trans, queer perspectives. It's black, trans, queer folk who put us in the streets with the slogan Black Lives Matter, and it is black, trans, queer folks who began Roads Must Fall in Cape Town and Roads Must Fall in Oxford. I think the vision of a new world that is being articulated from black, trans, queer perspectives is empowering, is transformative, and is the vision to which institutions should be listening right now.
Thank you. Natalie, your work is at the Horniman, and it seems that the Horniman has some kind of access to be able to actually start doing things that other institutions find impossible. So what's going on up the South Circular in?
I would say that the Horniman is still relatively slow. We might kind of compare it to the British Museum and say, oh, well, aren't they doing great? But they could be doing much better. And I think we should acknowledge that. You know, we were just saying, I was saying, the Benin bronzes are finally going back, but they've been at the museum for 130 years. So, you know, the museum has profited off the Benin bronzes for 130 years before returning them. I guess in terms of museums in general, of kind of what they should be doing. I think one of the problems that museums come across is that they are such inherently conservative organizations, conservative with a small c. You know, part of the problem is resourcing, so they are largely under-resourced. The people who work there don't get paid very much money. They're predominantly women. They're predominantly on precarious contracts. So there is all of that problem. But part of it is just like what a museum is designed to do is conserve. It's to preserve in time. And so they just really struggle to move with times because their whole remit is to conserve, it's to keep, it's to kind of, preserve in kind of amber. So that's why they struggle so much. So I think, if I was going to give advice to museums, it would be to move away from this, unlearn this aspiration towards conservation. I think an immediate thing they could do is just not have permanent displays anymore. If you have a permanent display, it's going to be out of date in a few years' time. And if you don't have permanent displays, then you probably shouldn't also have permanent collections. There should be much more transience, much more flow, much more dynamism, and that would allow for like a lot more conversation. So maybe that was my kind of most radical thought for the day.
That's amazing. So like a kind of like rotating, sort of touring exhibitions, and maybe things could be shared around more and things like that.
Yeah, and they shouldn't be afraid of de-accessioning objects. They shouldn't be afraid of lots of the objects I work with. They're not objects of national import. They're personal collections. They're bracelets and jewelry and pipes and combs and things like that. And they shouldn't be afraid of de-accessioning those things, of allowing those things to be used, to be held, to be broken, to create art with them. That kind of thing. So I think, there's a huge, of course, the Benin bronzes, we want to preserve them for future generations, but there's a lot of collections that don't have necessarily that significance or that meaning outside of kind of the communities that created them. And they should kind of be allowed to hold them and use them and make art and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things that has cropped up on many occasions in the conversations that we've been having is that maybe museums might be a place that could accommodate some of the more controversial statues, especially when one of the arguments is that they need to be conserved because they're important sort of works of art in their own right. And I wonder, Robert, whether what your views are on kind of how the recontextualization of these statues might be achieved, or sort of what's the sort of the positive way forward for what to do with these controversial items and figures?
Well, let's start off by saying there's no one right answer, and we have to respond individually to the objects, but we also need a framework for decision making. And what happens to objects might be very different in very different circumstances. But I agree with what you're saying about collections, but I also view sort of the public realm and buildings, and because I'm an architectural historian, as just as much a historical text as words on a page, as a document. Food can tell us about history and society, hairstyles, fashion, and architecture and monuments too. And so my response is not to remove entirely, although removal to a museum may sometimes be the right answer. Relocation may sometimes be the right answer. But often I think it's much more interesting if we turn sites of honour to undeserving sites of honour into sites of shame or sites of conscience, that we add new artistic or architectonic layers to a place that changes their meaning or unveil lies and tell us the truth about the past instead of lies about the past. And I think, but again, I come back, there's no one single answer in it, and it very much depends on circumstances. And I think sometimes aesthetics do matter as well, aesthetic value. Like, I think it's the Thomas Guy is perhaps the oldest public statue we have in the UK. That is a factor we should be considering in our decision-making about what to do with it. And I think it's by Scheermakers, is it? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Very important sculpture. It has historical value, it has aesthetic value. And I don't think anybody's suggesting we get rid of it, which is kind of what's happening in parts of the states there's a plan to sort of melt down some statues and recast them as new artworks, which I think is, in some circumstances may be okay if they're just these job lot sentinels put up under Jim Crow, but we have to think very carefully about how we're doing, how we make our decisions.
Right. Okay. I mean, you're talking there about sort of melting statues down and things like that. I want to introduce a figure, and I don't know who's going to pick this one up, but it's a figure that's been very close to a lot of the conversations that we've been having over the last year, and they were mentioned on Tuesday in the discussion as well. And that figure is a prominent health fundraiser, a philanthropist, a government confidant, an intimate friend of the royals and a knight of the realm. And that person, of course, is Jimmy Savile, who instantly had all kind of public memorialisation excised. And, kind of understandably, it's quite understandable. But the prevailing argument against doing that kind of thing when we're talking about people involved in the transatlantic slave trade is that we should retain and explain. And so my question to all of you is, shouldn't we be doing that with Jimmy Savile and explaining and retaining him in the public consciousness? Why is it different?
Actually, the Jimmy Savile statue came up during the Colston statue, right, unsurprisingly, and we said the very thing that you've said, which is it is not unknown as times change, as matters become known about individuals, that statutes are removed completely. But I think it does go back to the point that's made. It depends on the particular circumstances, but you can't wait forever. You can't wait forever, be it to recontextualize or to remove, because the fear, and this came out during the Colston trial particularly, was that, because there's no agreement about what to do, we'll just push it back and push it back. And then the prosecution kept cross-examining the defendants by saying, well, you should have just kept going. You should have just kept lobbying the council, you could have kept petitioning, you could have kept doing something else, but the institution doesn't respond to do either. And it came up in two of the advocates' speeches, but we've all heard that argument that it's not the right time. We've all heard that argument in relation to racism or moving on, and it was put, and we quoted it extensively. It was dealt with by Martin Luther King in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And we said during the course of the trial, when is the convenient season? We've been arguing about this for 100 years. When do you suggest, how much longer do we wait? And I think your first question, what is the warning to institutions? The warning to institutions is, if you don't act and do something, then others will take over.
Right, okay. I mean, immediately after the conclusion of the trial, you said on Channel 4 News, it's shameful the prosecution was ever brought in the first place. And I think, in fact, you said something, if I'm right, that the statue itself was the crime. And I'm just wondering what you think the importance of that kind of transgressive protest is in advancing the narrative on social issues.
Well, the Colston trial and the aftermath, at that time, there was a moment in which it felt like things were going to change. You had the commission in the mayor's office, various local authorities set up their own reviews. And certainly in Bristol, it led to a fundamental review of anything connected to Colston. Streets were renamed, schools were renamed, and indeed, I think it was only 2 weeks ago that a church that in their stained glass window, which had Colston as the image, has replaced it with an image of a civil rights march. Now, I personally think that none of that would have happened but for the actions of those 4 individuals. And that's why I stand with them, I applaud them, and I think they've done a massive service to the issue of dealing with legacy. That is not to say that we pull down every single statue. There were particular circumstances in Bristol that led to that, and in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd. But I think the warning is there. The warning is there that the people are ahead of the institutions, that things can bubble up unexpectedly. Nobody expected Colston to happen, and you better act before the people do.
Right, okay, yeah, thanks. Robert, I'm interested in your perspective on what sometimes happens after statues are toppled, because Colston's not necessarily it's not the only example of that. The recurring argument is that if we take these monuments down and remove them from view, that we don't get to learn from history. And so, what's your experience of when that has happened, perhaps in sort of post-communist Eastern Europe or post-war Germany or somewhere like that, where monumentation has been removed?
I think there's a lot to be learnt by looking at how different totalitarian, post-totalitarian societies have dealt with their monuments. Italy, Spain, Eastern Bloc, and Germany. They've all handled things in different ways. And there's lots of myths about how they were handled. So, for instance, in Nazi Germany, it was the Allied forces who removed most of the symbols. There wasn't much figurative statues to Nazi figures, so there was a different dynamic there. And there's this impression, though, that Germany, after the war, swiftly took down all the imagery and symbolism, but that wasn't the case. In fact, they were using some Nazi architects to build concentration camp memorials after the war. Just outrageous things were happening for a few decades. It took a long time in the sort of the 68 generation to force radical change in Germany. And so a really interesting culture, things like counter memorials and different ways of dealing with problem sites emerged. And so the language in Germany, there's a word for Mahnmal, is a statue that commemorates a scar or a problem. And there's very sophisticated ways of thinking that didn't happen in Italy, for instance, where basically they took away figures of Mussolini and renamed a few streets, and that was it. Everything else stays the same. The political outcomes of that, I would say, aren't really that different. And this is where I think we need to be careful about giving too much power to memorials and statues. They don't have much power over us, and we have the agency to change things. And I think there's a lot of bizarre, especially on the right, this kind of weird feeling that if the statues go, societies will collapse, which is just nonsense. And maybe there's also an opposite perspective, that these statues cause physical harm, which I think takes a point too far as well. And there's a sort of a thread throughout the built environment and architecture. There's a kind of determinism that if our environment is like this, it will cause us to behave like that. A sort of causality, a deterministic causality. And life and statues are just not like that. They don't have that power over us, and the agency is always with people to change and alter and layer and move about. And going back to Germany, what was interesting there is that there was a very rich culture of innovative ways of memorialization that came to an abrupt halt after reunification. And what we're seeing today in Germany is the far right recreating the past, and the hard right. And Dresden, Frankfurt, Berlin, buildings are being resurrected from ruins, or the ruins have gone, and they're being recreated as facsimiles in a kind of effort to deny the past. And I think that is just far more problematic than removing a statue. It's the faking of the past is the bigger problem.
So do you mean like, say, the new Humboldt University in Berlin that's kind of
Yeah,
looks
the
like this
Humboldt
sort of,
is one.
this kind of sort of 18th century
yeah.
palace?
But like the Potsdam Garrison Church, which has had its tower just being rebuilt at the moment, that was it was a symbol of Nazi Germany. It's where Hindenburg and Hitler shook hands and democracy came to an end. It featured in Goebbels' radio broadcasts and on Third Reich banknotes. And yet here we are in 2023 reconstructing it. And I think those questions are far more threatening. If we can't trust our past to be real, to be accurate, to be authentic, then we're in trouble. Which is something Hannah Arendt once wrote. And I think taking away a few statues is the least of it, really.
So is that a similar? Would you concur with that conclusion, Nathaniel? With
I'm
your
minded
work
to disagree with you, Rob. It is not a matter of causality, it is a matter of will. What it would take for our society to take down, to topple all statues, for all statues to fall, is a certain will that, if it were mustered up, would actually constitute the transformation of society. We wouldn't have to wait causally for the transformation of society to happen as a result. And so I think it is important that we continue to campaign for all of these colonial statues to fall. And what does fall mean? Not all commemorative memorials are sculptures. Not all sculptures are statues. A statue is a very specific piece of art. In fact, it's a very colonial piece of art, given statue mania, the period, 1850, for about 100 years, when statues were put up. A statue is generally anthropomorphic. It represents a human being. It's often larger than life, and it's almost always raised aloft, typically on a pedestal, or like Rhodes, on high above not only two king emperors, but also two archbishops, and opposite God. It's opposite the University Cathedral. The point of a statue is to elevate, is to glorify. It's not your average piece of art. And so I think it is, we are entitled to contest and to challenge any statue that exists in public space. If we have a society that purports to be egalitarian, that purports to be about grounded in the equality of persons, what are we doing in public space raising some persons above others? And here's the key thing about statues: every statue demands, invites, exacts from you that you look up. What kind of a thing is that to teach children? What kind of a society is a society of statues? The world of statues, said Frantz Fanon, is the colonial world. That is its definition. End the world of statues, you end the colonial world.
Can I just reply to some of that? I agreed with a lot of it and all the problematic nature of statues and whether we should have a memorial culture at all, especially a figurative one. It is hugely problematic. But thinking that changing statues changes society, that's for the birds. It's not, it will not change. If we could remove every statue tomorrow, society would remain pretty much unchanged. And that's where I think statues can be a distraction. It's not in the States, but Confederate statues in the States are a particular case because they were put up as like territorial markers as part of Jim Crow. So they have quite a different role in the public realm to, say, colonial statues in London. But often the big issue in the States, I would say, is the new Jim Crow. It's the carceral state. It's racism. And I don't think taking a statue is not going to make much difference to that. It might be a symbol of change, but it's not in itself change.
I think it varies yet again according to the statue. I think in Colston, it was important that that was removed because it wasn't just the statue, it was the plaque. Here's the chief executive of Slavery Incorporated, in which he's described as the most noblest and wisest son of Bristol. If that's not offensive to any individual and citizen of Bristol, what is? So of course it at least had to be contextualized or removed. But I was just thinking about this earlier today, because you may tell from my accent I'm not from London. I'm from the north of Ireland. And there's a very famous statue outside Parliament in the north, the statue of Edward Carson outside Stormont. Mr. Carson was the leader of a paramilitary group that created Northern Ireland, and he created it, and he said that it was a Protestant land for a Protestant people, and immediately set about really creating an apartheid state. That statue remains, and there is nothing more powerful about what the change in society in Northern Ireland was. When after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, you had Martin McGuinness standing next to that statue as the Deputy First Minister. That was all the contextualization anyone needed. And that was the real symbol of how the North had changed. So it very much depends upon where we are as a people in our historical moment and what that particular monument means at that time. And so I think sometimes may not even need contextualizing in terms of plaques. It is how we deal with it as a society.
Thanks.
Can I, sorry, can I?
Come in.
I think also if you think about kind of what a statue is, it's a kind of nation-making tool. It's a tool, it's not that it's representative of like a pre-existing cohesive national identity. It is a tool through which we construct our national identity, through which we construct our collective sense of self. So when the situation calls for it, the removal of a statue is equally an expression of that collective sense of self, right? And to me, it's quite an aspirational expression of a sense of self. It's an aspiration towards being a nation that actually lives and actually embodies ideals of diversity and equality and multiculturalism. So I think there is a tendency to see removal of statues as a lack, as an absence, as a taking away, but it's not. I think it's a really constructive act, and I think it kind of says something about who we want to be, even if we might not yet be that kind of nation. So I think, that basically I think that it really depends, and I think it can actually be quite a constructive process. Certainly thinking about James Baldwin, evoking people, 3 black men standing over Cecil Rhodes or whatever it was, I think we can think of it as actually quite a constructive process.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. The kind of what we can be enabled to do by doing something, and I think a lot of the debate around this is hamstrung by the unwillingness to do anything. So nothing happens. So things atrophy, and then we don't move on. So we don't create the conditions for transformation.
I think that's right. I think the gatekeepers are often the problem. And there's a rich tradition of guerrilla memorialization of people making change with their own hands. And one I particularly like is outside the Stonewall Inn in New York, which is led by black trans queer people. The statue is two white figures, and two trans activists dressed it up in clothing to sort of change its meaning and its gender and its colour. And that there's a huge tradition of those kind of guerrilla actions that bring our attention to things and change meaning. And sometimes the like the fourth plinth, it's the temporariness, it's the intervention, it's the change and the repeated change that gives something its power, rather than something we just walk past and don't see anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking in the office yesterday, and I don't know whether this is just a sort of an apocryphal tale, but apparently there's a statue of Marie Antoinette in Martinique who had her head removed by protesters, and they put the head back on the statue, and then it was removed again. And there's this amazing sort of call and response between the people and the memorial, which I thought sounded like quite good fun.
And meanings change as well. There's like the Gladstone statue in Bow, with its hands painted blood red. For a long time, today it's seen as a commentary on the Gladstone family's involvement in plantation slavery, but a few decades ago, when that paint started to appear, it was often seen as related to the match girls strike and labour conditions, and because Gladstone did a favour with the Bryant and Wills, the match manufacturers nearby. So even the meaning of the symbolism can change over time as well.
So you mentioned Martinique. I was in Martinique at the beginning of last month, principally to meet with people who have a stake in the public space in which they live. We have a lot to learn from our French counterparts. Martinique is a département outre-mer, so it's part of France. Make of that what you will. A statue was toppled, 2 statues were toppled in Martinique at least a week prior to the police murder of George Floyd. It's important that we remember this. Edward Colston in Bristol was not the first statue to come down in 2020. What we should learn from this, I think, I'd invite you to go out and think carefully about the situation. But in Martinique, the statues were of Victor Schulcher, who is France's William Wilberforce. He, if you believe the story, emancipated us in 1848 single-handedly. Young people in Martinique chose statues of Victor Schulcher, their liberator, to topple. One in the suburb called Schulcher, and one in the center of the capital, Fort-de-France. And then they attacked, of course, the statue of Marie Antoinette, which had a long history in Martinique of being attacked. And then they attacked the statue of Desnambouc, the guy who apparently discovered Martinique for the French. I think the fact that not only did they challenge or contest a statue of Napoleon's wife, who encouraged him to reinstitute enslavement after it had been abolished by the revolutionary government, but also that they attacked a statue of abolitionist, someone, a white man who was supposed to be liberal and on our side, I think could teach us something. Why haven't there been any criticisms of statues of William Wilberforce yet? Reclaim, what are they called? The outfit that Professor Nigel Bigger runs. It's Reclaim History or something like that. They put out a letter. They put a letter in the Times in July 2020, I think, or 2021, saying, there are no statues of abolitionists. We believe that we should start putting up statues of abolitionists. And they named William Wilberforce, amongst others. And of course, there are statues of William Wilberforce in Hull, for instance, where he's from. This got me thinking, and I encourage you to start thinking, where are our statues of the so-called nice white people? Not the enslavers, the ones who liberated us. And why haven't we yet started to question them and question the way in which and the perspective from which they liberated us.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, we could take that just down the road to Clapham, where there's sort of the Clapham sect and the church that's there. And I can't remember the name of the person, but a lot of the windows are commemorating someone who was in the congregation with these abolitionists, but he was also making his fortune from the supply of clothes to the enslaved people that were being transported. So I mean, everything was deeply sort of enmeshed. I want to move on in just a sec to take some questions from the audience. I have to say, I'm really impressed that we've managed to do Savile, Nazis, Northern Ireland. Well done, Raj. And the idea of having statues that there can be this kind of call and response. It's like maybe we should get a statue of Thatcher going down on Windrush Square so that we can kind of have a bit of a conversation in the public realm with that. And it's actually just a Windrush Square that I want to quickly move, because of course Windrush Square until 20 odd years ago wasn't called Windrush Square. It was called Tate Gardens, and we had the first of these sessions in the Tate Library. And outside the Tate Library, there's a bust of Henry Tate, which has recently had a new kind of coat of paint that's turned up, so there might be some work there for you, Raj. In Tuesday's discussion, the thought was posited, right, that Tate, and we've heard this from the Tate gallery as well, the thought was posited that Tate was all right because he was 13 when slavery was abolished, so there's no way that his name can be besmirched. And I'll start with you, Natalie, because obviously you're working in a sort of philanthropic a collection that was started by someone who traded tea, and of course Tate is very connected to tea through the sugar. And I'm just, do you think that the sort of the focus on these figures, on these people who are memorialised, and sort of defined by sort of sometimes arbitrary dates, does that hinder our ability to talk about those wider issues of extraction and ongoing injustice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does, and I think that's kind of one of my goals with kind of scrutinizing the kind of legacy of Horniman, was to kind of say, let's plug him back into these extractive forces of empire. Let's plug him back into what was the motivation for the Opium Wars, what was the motivation for colonial expansion. It was precisely for resources like sugar, like tea, and Horniman was a kind of liberal MP, he was a social philanthropist, he was very interested in workers' rights in the UK, but he was not interested in the workers' rights in the plantations in China where he was sourcing his tea. And I think if we focus too much on the individual figures, we do lose a sight of how incredibly banal and everyday and intertwined legacies of colonial violence and slavery are in our kind of everyday lives, in literally living in Britain in 2023. And I think one of the kind of key turning points in that conversation was the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, that kind of tried to move away from saying, it's not just about saying this person owned X number of slaves, this person. It's about saying, where is the money now? Because that money from exploiting workers in China is in Forest Hill. So I think it is a bit of a hindrance when we focus too much on individual figures. We need to plug them into a wider story about a network of commodities, of resources, of extraction. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. That's amazing. And I love your use of the word banal, which of course echoes what you said about Hannah Arendt earlier, who famously coined the phrase the banality of evil as she was covering Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem. Over to the audience. Who has questions for our panel? Someone's got to go first. Oh.
Apologies if this might have been addressed previously, but I think usually when you think about the discourse of statues, it's around kind of removing them or replacing them, and I'm interested in the aspect of kind of how memory and kind of the commemoration of our feelings towards a statue or actions towards a statue. Like, for example, if, you know, a statue is toppled, you're actually leaving the statue there toppled, or, you know, if a statue is toppled, you put it back, and the next year you take it down again, and it's a kind of continual thing. And I'm thinking about what your feelings are towards kind of you know, the different takes on how you would deal with statues in that way, and memory, and commemorating like the feelings and actions to a statue.
Thanks. Who wants to take that?
It's a tricky one. There's a book by, what's it called, I can't remember his name, called In Praise of Forgetting, which makes a very convincing argument about why we should stop remembering so much. And he talks about the ancient Greek practice of putting their memorials up in timber so they would decay over time, and the enmity of the war would gradually erode. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, but only if you're within a society, in a situation where you have the freedom to make that change, and the power to make that change. And I think one of the problems we get again and again is who has the power to make the change, and the power to pull the imagined community together via the built environment and our monuments, and tries to enforce a collective memory on us. But I'm much less interested in memory these days. I know it's a fashionable area of academia, and I've written a book called The Destruction of Memory, but more and more it's the facts of history and the evidence of history that I think we should prioritise, not ideas of what we about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I am also kind of maybe increasingly interested in the kind of aesthetics of removal and what that can kind of add, I guess, to the kind of built environment. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and someone was showing a film that they had made which was about the removal of the statue of King Leopold. And the aesthetics of it, I just couldn't help but connect that to some of the work that I look at, which is like the removal of cultural artifacts. And it looked so similar to historical photographs, particularly of Egypt, so the removal of kind of large kind of figurative artifacts. So I do think there is potentially something there about kind of using that aesthetics of removal, of toppling, as a kind of different sort of commemoration. But of course that would depend on kind of each individual circumstance. And I guess just personally from my perspective, I do think that Edward Colston should have stayed in the water. And that would have been a kind of more powerful statement.
I'm excited by the way in which contemporary artists are innovating and creating exciting ways to intervene in public space, especially public space that has hitherto been occupied by colonial statues. That said, the government, in its response to June 2020, in its response to a call for Black Lives Mattering, and the assertion that Black lives do matter and that they should do something about that to protect our Black lives, responded by protecting statues, colonial statues, with a policy called Retain and Explain, which they announced, I think, in January 2021. I think that retain is dissociable from explain. I don't think the two necessarily need to go together. And the idea that you need to retain to explain, I think, is closely associated with this strange idea that statues teach, that statues are history or history books, or the plaques underneath statues constitute history education. A statue never taught anyone, apart from to teach them to look up and to feel low and to feel unworthy in relation to. I think that we need more explanation. And the explanation can happen without the statues being in public space. I defer on this to Len Garrison, the co-founder, along with Queen Mother Moore, of the Black Cultural Archives just down the road. Len Garrison once said, and I thank the archivist there, Hannah Ishmael, for bringing this to my attention, Black archives are monuments, and we need our monuments. What would it be for us to reconceive a monument, not as a statue, but as an archive? And what is an archive? It's not just a plaque. It's many things. It's not just paper documents, but it's oral histories. But what if we were to think of our monument as a place where we can really go to get explanations?
Don't entirely agree with Nathaniel about sort of the removal of all statues and all memorials. I like heroes. I like to look up to people, and I like the memorialization of the people that I want to be memorialized. That's the problem. It's who chooses. But I remember going when my kid was really young down the South Bank and just happening to walk past the Mandela statue and thinking, that's really good. It's really good that I can walk past and explain to him, and just, obviously it requires a lot more explanation than walking past a monument, but I think it triggers discussion at times, and I don't mind there being memorials in that way. The difficulty with the idea of guerrilla adaptions of statutes or removing or whatever is not just the government's response about retain and explain. It's the government's response to protest in that they've criminalized the damaging of memorials or statutes with the idea that you have a maximum of a 10-year prison sentence directly as a result of the Colston case. That is fairly unconscionable, but it's a warning that the authorities are going to come down hard in future on either be it guerrilla tactics or complete removal of statutes, and I'm afraid that's the world that we're living in. And people can talk about the culture war and how we shouldn't have a culture war. Sometimes I think we are in a culture war, and I'm afraid we've got to win it, rather than standing by the sidelines and saying, well, there are other ways to do it.
Yeah, cheers, Raj. Next, we've got a question here, and then there are 1, 2, 3, 4 more. Excellent.
Hi, thank you. We're here to talk about Thomas and Guy. Isn't the bigger monument actually the names of the hospital? Do the statues become less relevant if the name of the hospital was to change? Hospitals was to change?
Yeah, I'll pick that one to start with. That's the kind of the oft-repeated cry of where does this all end? And there's been, one of the greatest ironies of our experience in this was people say, where will this all end? I.e., we can't change the name of the hospital. And this was raised without any irony in a discussion that we were having at the site of the Guy statue in an institution called King's. And no one had actually stopped to think that actually it ends with you not studying at King's or Queen's or things like that. So I think absolutely. But who wants to pick that up?
I am a patient of both St Thomas's Hospital and subsequently Guy's Hospital. My clinic moved from the one to the other. And I was aghast to hear where the money had come from to support my health. And then I began to think about the ways in which the vagaries, not just of the National Health Service, but of healthcare in general, as offered to people racialized as black in contemporary days, might have something to do with the ways in which people racialized as black were thought lesser or thought subhuman in days of yore. What is, I say, as a patient of these hospitals, the relationship between the less than adequate healthcare that I receive as a person racialized as black in this system, and the stigmatization, animalization of people of African descent under under the aegis of people like Thomas Guy. If he enriched himself in the South Sea bubble, what does that mean for what the people who use his money and purport to be acting in my interests, what does it mean for the good faith or the faith of those people?
We'll maybe move on. I mean, but we have often said to the people there that perhaps they, amongst all of the institutions, have a superpower because their purpose absolutely should be the care of the community they serve, and that might be a way to navigate these things. And other people might be, their purpose might be political, it might be economic, it might be, but theirs is expressly the positive health outcomes and positive health, kind of equity that needs to be striven for. So we haven't given up on them yet. Sorry, remind me of who had a question. There's the orange T-shirt.
Snail.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
it's me,
I've
Snail.
got my specs on. Sorry, no. Yeah.
All good. Yeah, I think a question I'd like to ask about statues and colonial legacies is, do we think that there could be more power in idealizing statues of those who sort of suffered the brunt of colonial legacies? Because off the top of my head, I can't think of any major statues and monuments to people that were enslaved or that died in genocides or were exploited or really terribly extracted from. I know we've spoken a bit about that there is a danger in, removing monuments that are already there. What about the power of, leaving those monuments as they are and then just creating monuments to the people who are sort of on the other side of that river, I suppose? I just want to know what you all think about that and whether that's more impactful. Thank you.
I think it's rebalancing that commemorative landscape is important, and some, especially I suppose, colonial capitals like Washington DC, Ottawa, Canberra have specific policies about how they balance their commemorative landscape to make them more inclusive and more diverse, and that's kind of what the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm has been doing as well, and which I was a member of until recently. It's about commissioning new work and commissioning, filling the gaps, people who are hidden from history, women, queer people, whoever it may be, black people, who aren't represented on a pedestal. That is important, but again, we come to the gatekeepers. What isn't being done is grasping the nettle of problem sites. Guys in St. Thomas's are pushing back against change there to the statues, even though there's been a lot of good work done about arguing why there needs to be change. And it's the gatekeepers who are the problem. So there is sort of an appetite for new work, but often that can disguise inactivity for dealing with problem sites.
So I think I will admit that I do have maybe a little bit of hesitancy around that approach, just a little bit. I could be persuaded. And actually, sorry, there's just something in this book by Christine Sharp. I think that my fear is that if you memorialize victims of slavery or of colonial violence, then you kind of relegate that to another time, something that happened, and you ignore you kind of ignore and you absolve yourself of any responsibility for the people who live today in 2023, whose lives are intimately impacted by these legacies of slavery and colonial violence, and you kind of, what Elizabeth Edwards would call, you put it in a spatial and temporal elsewhere. And there's this really, if you don't mind me also reading a quote, This is from Christina Sharp, and she's talking about these kind of never again memorial narratives. So she's kind of talking specifically about memorials to victims of slavery and lynching. But I think that kind of never again narrative is also quite familiar to us in Europe, probably in the form of Holocaust memorials, where we kind of foreground the violence, we're very confrontational with the violence in the hope that we will instill in people a responsibility to make sure it never happens again. But she's a bit skeptical about that kind of use of violence. And I'll just read a little tiny section. So she says, how does one inhabit the never again and ask that a population come to terms with such ongoing terror and quotidian atrocity? How does one come to terms with a brutal imagination by engaging and representing over and over again the materialization of that imagination? And she has another really good bit here where she says, entering this space, one is asked to assume a certain position, asked to embrace memorial narratives that offer Black suffering as a pathway to knowledge, national and racial healing, reparation and reconciliation, asked to embrace a narrative that acknowledges violence only to frame it as anomalous and intermittent and not foundational and ever-present. So I kind of think Christina Sharp said it perfectly there, and that's kind of my small hesitancy about that approach.
Thanks. Oh, okay, at the back, and then we'll come to you slightly closer.
Oh, well, I'm going to speak because...
I'm sorry, yes, you did have your hand up.
It came to me first. Yeah, I wanted to ask a question a few times. I've been to a few of the events this week, and I think about the audience. The audience is somebody who walks through Windsor Square, the audience who sees the statues. They have some voice, and a collective voice, as has happened. So the question is, when sculptors particularly, and I'm thinking of Hugh Locke, who is a Brixtonian, walks past the Tate every day, and now is in the Tate and is a Royal Academician. He wasn't selected for the 4th plinth, but he said he would have put a cage round. He said there's all the men are on horseback, and he made a piece on horseback. And now, a few years on, it's now shown the Baltic and the Tate. It's gone around the world. I can't speak on slavery. I can speak as a sculptor who has been on the plinth for Anthony Gormley's work. Now, the thing I did for Anthony Gormley's plinth, which was called Each One, something like that, hundreds, probably 1,000 people went for an hour on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square. I went on as the unknown woman artist, the tomb of the unknown woman artist. The point I was trying to make was that we're all collective, we all have an audience, we all have agency. And thank you today for bringing that to us in various ways, political, legal. What do you think the audience who hasn't got the intellectual grasp would think if all the statues are taken down? Would they put their own ones up?
So, okay, go for it, Nathaniel.
So I rather think that Professor Christina Sharp said it all, and I rejoice that you bring her into the room. Do think carefully about the work that is being done in Toronto, Canada, by Professor Christina Sharp and Professor Ronaldo Walcott and others. I think that can be very helpful for us here in Britain as we build Black studies from Black, queer, trans perspectives. Here's another quotation. In answer to your suggestion, this is Audre Lorde. For our children have grown in the shadow of what was the shape of marble between their eyes and the sun. We do not wish to stand great marble statues between our children's eyes and their sun. I take it that Professor Lorde, and she was professor, is referring also to statues of people racialized as Black. What I said a little earlier about what a statue isn't simply a matter of what a statue of a person racialized as white is. It's also a matter of what a statue of a person racialized as black is. Audre Lorde also said that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Erecting a statue is to harness a master's tool. Notice another thing about statues, that they're typically of individuals. Very rarely, if ever, do you see a statue of a collective. And yet, I know, Raj, that you rightly pointed out the Colston Four, and I take my hat off to them for pursuing their defense against this suit. However, it was not only the Colston Four that brought down the Colston statue. I wasn't there, but I saw many people in the streets, right up that hill. It's collectivities who change the world. And if there are to be any heroes, the heroes are the collectivities. But it tells us something, that statues are never of collectivities, because they don't want us to have collective action, public mobilization as something to look up to. I don't think that in the history of black liberatory thought, it's individuals who are the heroes. I think it's collectives. So until a collective of black liberatory folk is chosen as the subject of a statue, I'm not interested.
Thanks. We've got time for a couple more. Right. Okay. So maybe we'll try and stick with the four. Yeah.
Sorry, it's just a quick thought. Given the discussion about the statues, would it make sense to take many of the most offensive statues, let's say, in the history of colonialism, put them in a museum or a collection, and just actually shine a light on colonialism and its history, right through the ages from Cromwell onwards, etc., and actually educate many people about what that actually means for peoples all over the world?
So who's going to take that? Should we have a
yes, that's one response, and that's happened in New Delhi. There's a Coronation Park in New Delhi where lots of imperial statues are really relocated to. It's happened in Budapest. It's happened in Moscow. It's being talked about in Antwerp for the colonial statues. It's one legitimate response. One could argue that it kind of removes a statue from an issue from debate by literally marginalising it in the city. But it's also a legitimate response, I think.
So there is another example of what you propose, Zitadelle in Berlin, a place, I think it's in northern Berlin, to which many statues of the German colonial era and the Nazi era have been, and also there's a head of Lenin, and they invite not just children but adults to sit on the head of Lenin. It's a very touchy-feely museum. That's what they invite. Maybe that's a good idea. And maybe we should do that here. But two things. One, in Bristol, they have a beautiful train station. Part of that train station used to be the Colonial and Imperial Museum. And it used to do some of what you're suggesting. It no longer does that. That museum no longer exists. And I think you need to think very carefully about why Britain wasn't able to retain such a museum when you're thinking about whether or not the museum that you are proposing could be not only created, but also sustained in this country. The second thing I'd say is, why are you so keen on keeping these statues? I guess, intact? And, is it because you're devoted to this aesthetic appreciation of them? Is that why they have to be kept in some state somewhere? I'm ambivalent about that, or rather, I feel that in weighing up in social injustice and aesthetic pleasure, I think social injustice sort of weighs more heavily.
Okay, we've got probably time for the last three, so we'll take. All right, yeah, go on. You're in charge, Ella.
First of all, I want to say me personally, anything that makes a human being look up is a plus. That's what I think. I see far too many people in their phones, see far too many young people looking down, and anything that encourages them to look up. But I'm not a fan of this idea of knocking down statues either, because I think you're just hiding the truth, you know what I mean? That's my take on it. But what really gets me about this conversation is the lack of innovation in it. And I got a man here, his name's Thor, yeah? Last year, or the year before, we did a project. I work for an organization called Black Thrive. We did a project where you could look at a QR code and you point your camera at the QR code and you'd see a statue. What Thor educated me on is that if there were 4 different QR codes, we'd all see different statues on the same thingy. So it doesn't matter if you see Edward Colston, because I'm not here to see Edward Colston. I'm here to see, I don't know, Nelson Mandela or something like that. Whatever you wanted to do. And I think, for me personally, that's the real solution. It's not about covering the history. If you want to know that this is the guy that did all of this nastiness, then you got to know. But then it's not necessarily about highlighting the history. So then you look at the other QR code, and then you see who's there. And then you can have whoever you want. So it's the innovation. I think Britain, 2023, this is 2023, people. Do you know what I mean? There's some stuff we could do here that could revolutionize this whole discussion across the world, man. That's what I think, anyway.
That leads nicely onto my question. I was just wondering, this is sort of looking at the past, right? We're thinking about the built environment. That's a limited resource in some ways. But if we think about the digital environment, which most people spend more time in than the built environment, I wonder whether this wouldn't be a problem, because some of the things you said was you want it to be transient. We build in wood or something, and that's probably true of the internet. You put something up, it'll be covered by the next day's news. So maybe this isn't a problem for the future, but I wondered do you think that we should be thinking ahead so that the way we give platforms is different in the digital environment, and how conversations about the past can inform that future? Yeah. Because I imagine our values will keep changing, right? It's not like now we know what we like and we just give the platform to this amazing value. It's that we'll keep reiterating that. So how does that work?
Who wants to take that? Does anybody want to respond to that?
I can respond to that. To both points. So, I mean, as you can probably guess, I'm largely pro-removal of certain statues, but I do really like what you've both kind of said about innovation, and I think particularly innovation towards a kind of sense of pluralism, a kind of multitude of perspectives and opinions. And I think about, Stuart Hall, when he's talking about, the national heritage, quote unquote, he kind of says, yes, we have to reinscribe the margins back into the center, but we can't always look backwards. We have to think about the present and we have to think about the future. And part of that is thinking about contemporary black art, for example, which, could also be expressed in the digital space. So I do think you have to kind of be doing both things at once. You have to be looking backwards and you have to be looking ahead at the same time. And I would love to see kind of more contemporary black art in public spaces as opposed to statues.
Cool.
Hi. I just wanted to raise something about the nature of statues. And the substance they're made out of tends to be stone, bronze, permanent sort of material. And there's something kind of, I think, I wanted to ask you about, should a statue is the problem with statues is the permanence. It's like, it's interesting to put a statue in place that may be contentious, but when we make it permanent, that's what's the sort of elevation that's problematic for me. And I just wondered whether, getting back, I thought your point, Nathaniel, was interesting about how could a statue be an archive? Is that, should we be rethinking, sort of further to what they're saying as well, should we be rethinking what statues, the nature of what a statue should be? Should it be perhaps a performance? Could the toppling of Edward Colston become an annual event and an affair? Like, if you go to Lewis at the fireworks time, there's this sort of procession down the street and they burn effigies. But, could statues become a performative thing? Should we be rethinking about the nature of, what a statue is? Does it just have to be made out of stone? Does it have to be just a permanent thing?
I think that's really interesting.
Can I just quickly add to that with regards to the idea of a statue looking up? I mean, we kind of also, as the Windrush, in terms of the Windrush monument at Waterloo, where we are actually looking at it at the same level. But I actually felt, yeah, great, but also felt almost anti this actually being there, because we're actually perpetuating or falling into the trap of building statues. And perhaps what we should do is look at that idea of innovation and being much more wider in terms of our creativity. I just don't, I'm not sure if I've got a question or I'm just making a statement, but it just feels like we're almost kind of falling into that trap of we need a statue to represent contemporary black creative or black artists or our people. Why replicate what?
Can I just add on to that about the idea of like hero worship as well?
Yeah.
But what makes a hero? There's a really interesting thing about neurodiversity and ADHD. That 4 in 10 people in prison incarcerated have got ADHD. Not because their ADHD makes you a criminal, but because the system has pushed you that way. And if you have ADHD, you're constantly told that you will never achieve and that you're not someone who is ever going to be a hero. So then is there a problematic in creating, you have to be a hero to be, the ultimate thing is to have a statue made. And is there something problematic in
I think Nathaniel's point about the collective is a really excellent one. And the notion of individual genius or hero status is deeply problematic. And maybe we should be celebrating conceptual things or collective things or movements for the positive, or investing in, as you say, in impermanence. There was, in the Russian Revolution, they erected a series of temporary monuments, partly because they understood that the context was fast changing, and the idea of a permanent monument to a society in flux was a strange one. Some argue that it was just because the only materials they had available were like plaster that would fall apart, and that it was a pragmatic decision. But yes, I think we do need new kinds of monuments, not bronze on a plinth. I think that era is over.
This is amazing. We've sort of like come into a place where we sort of start off talking about statues and monumentation, and we're at a place of collectivism and ritual, and kind of this has been absolutely amazing. I mean, I think we probably have to like kind of close it now because we're at 8 o'clock. This could go on into all manner of things. It's making me think of ritual and those kind of those repeated sort of behaviours and how we can come. I mean, we've essentially been talking about how we navigate this kind of time of transformation, and I think the fact that we have so much focus on statutory and monumentation, and it's partly because of you see change being manifested. So your work, Raj, of defending people who've gone taken down one of these statues. And we were talking in the office earlier about just a little exercise that we just wanted to do at the end, and just to kind of gauge the temperature of the room, because we've talked a lot about, there's been quite a lot of Colston talk, and I just wondered if we could maybe have a show of hands in the room, just to see how many people think that it was right that the Colston statue came down. Okay, that's an overwhelming majority of the people in the room. I want to ask you a second question. Who wants to go and pull down the statue of Henry Tate now in Windrush Square? We've got the right man with us.
I've got business cards to distribute.
It's not so easy, is it? Yeah? So the Colston Four were right, and we need to tell a better story about Tate and enduring inequality, but it's not so easy to go and do it. So I just wanted to, it's been an evening.
I disagree, I think it is easy.
It is, well, yeah, I'll just say, it's been an evening of quotes, so I'm gonna finish with a quote, and it's a quote from, it's a quote from a bloke called David Graeber, and it's from his short work, The Utopia of Rules, and it's an amazing one. It bookended Adam Curtis's last but one program, and it's that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. And I think that's potentially our task as we kind of navigate this. So thank you, Robert, thank you, Raj, thank you, Nathaniel, thank you, Natalie. It's been absolutely amazing. And thanks to everyone.